The morning the fence went up, the valley woke as it always did. Thin fog twisting across the long grasses, horses cropping at the edge of the corral, and the distant cut of a cowbell that sounded like someone tapping a metronome on the world. I was leaning against the corral gate, coffee steaming in both hands, watching the sun push itself over the ridge when I first saw the men from the HOA. They were methodical, efficient in that way city people are when they come to perform a small war on the countryside. Clipboards, measuring tapes, hard hats, and a polite look that never reaches the eyes. They did not approach me. The chairman, a man I'd only met at the one community meeting where he politely corrected my fence line, spoke through a woman with a clipped ponytail and a folder of documents. He told me, with the slow, rehearsed certainty of someone reading from a script, that the board had authorized installation of a security fence along the boundary to preserve community character and safety. He pointed to a wedge of my land and then to the gravel road that had carried me into the ranch for 20 years. "This is going to protect everyone," he said, as if protection were something that could be boiled down to a surveyor S stake and a ledger entry. Their fence killed the road. 1 week later, there was a gate with a sign, "Private Road, HOA Access Only." No one from the board had bothered asking me. They didn't have to chase me off the land, not with their lawyers and homeowners meetings and three-part motions. They simply strung steel and wood across the gravel and, with a single motion of nails and hinges, turned the road into a symbol and a barrier. I'm not a man who likes to make spectacles. I don't believe in dramatic confrontations unless the occasion calls for it. An offense is not the kind of thing to anger me enough to burn bridges down. But I also know the history of this place. My grandfather bought the ranch with a clap of money and little else. He cut the trees that had been pasted like a windbreak along the creek, built the first barn with his bare hands, and taught me how to hold a rope so a scared horse would listen. This land had been a home and a livelihood for 3 generations. The road was not simply a line on a map. It was the spindle that held our lives together. Feed deliveries tractor access my sister's car the night she gave birth to her first child, the volunteer fire crews in winter storms. For the HOA to barricade it was an act of bureaucratic vandalism. So I did what any rancher knows. I assessed what I had and worked with it. I started small. A friend of mine, Elias, who runs a hauling business in town, gave me a coffee and a look when I told him the story. "You can't just drive through?" he asked, incredulous. "You can, if you want to be on their calendar for a lawsuit," I said. "But I don't want to fight them in court. I want to change the game." He grinned like a man who eats plans for breakfast. "Okay, what's your play?" I walked the line of their fence that afternoon, tracing the new posts with my fingertips, imagining the pattern of their votes and iron. Under the fence, someone had left a gap for drainage, a shallow, camouflaged culvert where the road swerved beside a stand of oak. The culvert was narrow, not wide enough for a truck, but it would take a wagon or an ATV or a car pulling a small trailer. It was a small hole in their big plan. The idea came like a draft that finds a crack in a door. If the HOA was going to declare the road private and insist on controlling access, why not charge for that access? If they wanted to turn our public convenience into a closed commodity, I would give them a market to manage, and in the process, run the market. I have a mechanic's mind. I also have a ledger's sense. For years, I'd kept an old receipt book in the glove compartment of my truck for odd expenses, and I'd learned how numbers can dull people, and how they can convince them too. The day after the fence went up, I set up a small table beside the culvert in a hollow shielded by sage and dog rose and painted a sign the color of a barn wall. "Private gate, toll road ahead, $10 per vehicle, $25 per tractor. All proceeds for road maintenance and emergency services." Underneath I wrote, in smaller letters, "Pay here, cash and Venmo." People laughed at first. The board members who drove up in their polished SUVs chuckled as they passed, used to owning the story and the road. A few neighbors eyed me suspiciously. But the valley has a sense of fairness carved into it. If someone takes what S shared and pretends it S theirs, folks will carve that back out again with little fuss and a solid hand. The first week, 10 cars parked and paid. A man delivering hay for my neighbor tipped 10 and said, "You run it, you fix it." The volunteer firefighters left 20 for the pump truck. My sister came by with fresh bread and paid me in the same breath. A woman who used to bring her kids to the creek for summer afternoons threw me a 5 and gave me a hug. The HOA called it unauthorized commerce and obstruction. Lawyers sent letters. The board chairman wrote a stern email accusing me of escalatory tactics and provocation. They put up their own sign beside mine. Restricted access. HOA members only. It was ugly, postmarked with the kind of righteousness that comes with committees and agendas. They thought of themselves as guardians. I thought of them as gatekeepers, and the difference is important. I met the first board member who came by in person at my table. He was a retired school principal with the kind of decisive gestures that carried a week of school meetings in their hands. He looked at my sign and then at the money dish and asked, with the soft disapproval of someone telling the truth to a trespasser, "Why are you charging for access to a private roadway?" "I'm not charging for access to your private roadway," I said. "I'm charging for access through a culvert that keeps our folks from getting stuck in mud. For the gravel I spread after the last flood for fuel for the pump the volunteer fire crew uses when the creek runs low. This money is to keep services running, not to buy anyone favors." He didn't like the answer. "You have no right," he said. "You are harassing." "If making a living out of keeping the road passable is harassment, then I suppose I'd better stop," I said. "But tell me this, when the widow on Maple Ridge breaks her axle because the HOA sealed the road and no one can get the tow truck in, who will she call? Who will pay to haul her out? I thought this community was supposed to be about neighbors helping neighbors." That stopped him. For a long second his face looked like a mask softened by a memory. He walked away without taking the money. The first legal salvo was a cease and desist notice, the kind with a law firm's logo and a header that suggested consequences. Their attorney served it with all the care of someone handling fragile china. They demanded I stop operating a toll and removed the sign immediately. I folded the letter, put it in my shirt pocket, and laughed at the print. "You gonna let them do this?" Elias asked that night at the diner. "They'll sue," I said. "They'll write lots of angry things. They'll tape them to our door, and the postman will deliver them with civility. But suits cost money, and motions cost time. The board likes being right in theory. They hate being wrong in practice." The valley took to the toll. It was not a grand scheme. I never intended it to be. I did not install turnstiles or toll booths or barbed gates. I collected with my hat and my honesty. I kept a ledger. I posted a weekly accounting sheet on the old oak behind my table. How much gravel we bought, how many gallons of diesel for the pump, how much to mend the culvert after the last spring melt. Transparency is a cruel and disarming weapon when your opponent's strength is secrecy. People came and paid. In the first month, we raised enough to bring in a small loader and spread 6 truckloads of gravel through the bog that had become worse since the fence. We hired an arborist to trim the overhanging branches that made night driving dangerous. We bought reflective markers for the road edges and a sensitive little generator for the volunteer fire crew. Eventually, the ledger showed a balance that made a grown man feel like a show-off. I didn't pocket a cent for myself. I bought tools and paid the guys who worked the loader. When the widow from Maple Ridge Tow came, I paid out of the fund for the towing. The HOA escalated in its own way. They made a regulation forbidding unsanctioned road use and threatened fines. They attempted to block the culvert with a temporary barricade one night, thinking to catch me off guard. I woke before dawn to see the board's security contractor, a tall, broad man in mirrored sunglasses, tightening chains around the culvert. He grinned like he'd won something he hadn't told anyone he wanted. I borrowed an old ox cart from Elias and at dawn pulled it around the back of the barricade. We carried coffee, a sack of gravel, and 3 chainsaws. Elias and I worked quietly. Where the chain had fastened, we moved it. Where the contractor had bolted, we unbolted it. The ox cart made a ridiculous sound, and the contractor's sunglasses glinted as a neighbor named Rosa wandered over to pass us coffee and a thermos of beans. She tapped the contractor on his shoulder and asked him, in a voice as plain as a headline, "Who authorized you, son?" He hesitated. "The board," he said. "Well, the board didn't authorize the rain," she said. "It doesn't make the mud less mud. We're moving the gate because we're reliable for kids and tractors and the volunteer fire truck. If you'd like to stay, you can help spread gravel." He frowned so hard his jaw ached. He did not help. The county sheriff's first visit was the one that mattered. He's a man who has worn the same badge for 15 years and has learned not to parade his weight where peace and pragmatism meet. He pulled up in an old squad and asked questions like a man who recognizes small-town rules. Who gets hurt if this stays closed? Who will be responsible if an ambulance can't get through? He read the HOA letters with a frown that made the chairman typed sentences look thin. "Look," he said finally by the corral fence where the geldings stamped their patience. "I understand property lines and all that, but if the fence being closed will create a hazard, a person trapped, a fire truck delayed, then you don't get to declare safety by shutting the way people need. You can't privatize emergency response." He didn't tell me to take the sign down. He didn't make arrests. He asked the board to reconsider via an informal talk that would be filed away like a polite ultimatum. The sheriff's caution carried weight. When a local man who had been silent broke his silence in a meeting, the board felt the edge of community resistance like a weather front. With the sheriff's nudge, the board convened a special meeting under the old community hall lights. They invited every homeowner. I went because the rules of the place dictated that if you wanted to change the map of the valley, you did so with a town meeting. The chairman stood at the podium with his thick folder-like armor, and he began to list the approved reasons for the fence: security, aesthetic uniformity, maintenance liability. People listened, and then they spoke. The widow from Maple Ridge told the room about the night the heater went out and the old man next door fell and how the volunteer responders had to take a longer route because of the fence. A young family spoke about their kids riding bikes to the creek and how the new gate had forced them into dangerous detours. A line of ranch hands talked about deliveries and hay and the practical economics of a road. They didn't speak like lawyers. They spoke like people who want to keep the things they need. By the end of the night, the chairman's folder had more fingerprints than it did triumph. A vote was called, and the board, surprised at the groundswell, saw the math of neighbors outweigh its bylaws. They voted to open the road to emergency vehicles and to negotiate a shared maintenance agreement. It was not a full reversal, but it recognized the public interest in a private space. The fence stayed up. The gate remained with a key ring that the sheriff's office kept in case of emergencies. But the toll did not vanish either. The fund I'd started became an official account that the community treasurer could sign off on, used to maintain the gravel stretches and to pay for the volunteer pump. The HOA, embarrassed and chastened, found itself the recipient of a community-led program to ensure access. Some board members wouldn't look me in the eye for weeks. The chairman resigned his post a month later, citing personal obligations. The valley didn't care all that much who sat on which committee. They cared that the road ran. There were consequences, of course. The legal letters stopped only once everyone realized that litigation would cost them more than the gravel. The board's attempt to privatize our passage had cost them goodwill, and once goodwill is bankrupted, you can't really run an organization on angry memos and formal meetings. The contractor who had chained the culvert found his name in town gossip and eventually had fewer jobs. As for me, I kept the ledger. I kept paying for gravel and helping the volunteer fire crew and making sure a widow could get her tow truck in when the axle snapped. I didn't become a hero or a villain. I became a man who kept his word and a notebook of tallies. People sometimes asked me why I'd even bothered to collect money in the first place. "You could have just fixed the road yourself," someone said once. I thought of my grandfather leaning on that same fence, showing me how to read the weather in the shape of clouds. "This land doesn't belong to a rule," he'd said, voice dry as dust. "It belongs to the folks who tend it." Charging for gravel wasn't theft. It was stewardship, a way to make sure the roads people needed were there when they needed them. The valley adapted. We had better signs marking the creek for kids, an emergency key box for the sheriff, and a schedule for the loader to spread gravel in spring. The board learned to come to the table instead of writing from the comfort of its office. They called me sometimes to ask about where the worst ruts were, and I told them, because it's better to be practical than triumphal. We shook hands. We argued in polite tones about fence posts and the right way to handle a drain. Life on a ranch means you don't live by grudges. You live by the next workday. Late one August evening, after a dry summer rain had walked the pasture with silver fingers, I stood by the culvert and watched a pickup cross the road. A child in the back leaned over and waved at me, a candid, small salute that was bigger than any resolution. The gate was open wide, not a barrier this time, but a threshold. The sign still stood, painted and honest. Private gate, maintenance fund. Below it, someone had taped a child's drawing of the valley, executed in crayon and enthusiasm, the fence drawn as a dotted line and the road as a ribbon. The picture made me laugh until the world tasted like warm hay. Opening that gate didn't fix everything. It did something better. It reminded us that land is a shared thing, not of ownership alone, but of purpose. When committees try to strip purpose for the sake of power, people will find a way to restitch the map. We turned their gate into a private toll road not to spite them, but to buy time and gravel and patience until common sense could be reinstalled. If you ask me what I learned, I'll tell you this. Fences are good for keeping things in and bad for keeping everything out. It's easier to build a fence than a bridge. It's harder but kinder to tend the road.